You won't believe what happened on a quiet afternoon in the middle of a crowded city street, the kind of day where people were busy with their shopping bags, cars honking at traffic, and children tugging on their parents' hands. When suddenly, a scene unfolded that left everyone frozen in shock. A scene so raw and disturbing that most people didn't even know how to react at first. It began with an old woman, fragile, her back slightly bent, carrying a cloth bag that looked far too heavy for her thin arms, crossing slowly at the corner where two police officers were stationed. At first, it didn't look like much. An ordinary pedestrian struggling to get across, but then voices rose, sharp and angry, cutting through the noise of the city. The officers started yelling at her, their tone far harsher than necessary, as though this elderly lady had done something terrible, just by standing there too long in their way. People glanced over, some curious, some uneasy, but most kept walking, because that's how it is in big cities. Folks don't want to get involved. But then, the shouts turned into something worse. One officer shoved her shoulder. The frail woman nearly lost her balance, and when she tried to explain herself with trembling words, the other officer grabbed her arm so roughly it made her cry out in pain. Suddenly, what should have been just another normal day spiraled into a nightmare. The officers pushed her down, her bag spilled open, oranges rolling across the pavement, a scarf fluttering away in the breeze, and in that moment, she looked, up with eyes full of fear, not understanding why she was being treated like this. Some people pulled out their phones, recording. Others gasped, but not a single person stepped forward because fear of authority ran deep in everyone's mind. The woman begged them to stop, her weak voice almost drowned out by the sound of the officers' boots hitting the pavement as they circled her like predators. It was heartbreaking, it was cruel, and it seemed no one would do anything until a figure appeared from across the street, a figure everyone recognized but could hardly believe was really there. With broad shoulders, a powerful stride, and an unmistakable presence, Mike Tyson, yes, the legendary heavyweight champion, was right there in the crowd. At first, people thought maybe they were seeing things, maybe it was just a look-alike, but as he pushed through the stunned onlookers, there was no doubt. His expression was serious, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with that same intensity that once terrified opponents in the ring. The entire atmosphere changed, tension snapping like a rope pulled too tight. The officers didn't notice him, at first too focused on manhandling the old woman, but the crowd began to whisper. Phones lifted higher because they knew something incredible was about to happen. Mike didn't rush. He didn't need to. His mere presence carried the weight of a storm building on the horizon. Every step he took seemed heavier than the last, and people moved aside instinctively, as if they knew this wasn't just a chance encounter, but a moment that would soon become unforgettable. And as he came closer, the old woman's eyes caught him, a flicker of hope sparking through her tears, because she recognized him too, and though she could barely speak, the faintest whisper of his name left her lips, like a prayer answered at the very last second. The moment Mike Tyson reached the edge of the scene, the air around him seemed to thicken, like everyone could sense the shift in energy, and for the first time the officers realized someone was approaching, someone who didn't carry fear in his body language, someone who didn't hesitate to step forward. They turned their heads, still holding the old woman down, and the younger of the two smirked, almost mocking, as if he didn't recognize who stood before him. But others did. Whispers rippled like waves through the onlookers. "That's Mike Tyson. Oh my God, it's him. Is he really about to intervene?" Some people gasped. Others pressed record on their phones even tighter, not wanting to miss a second, because they knew this wasn't just going to be a minor altercation. It was about to become a story people would talk about for years. The older officer barked something harsh, telling Mike to move along, calling him sir, but with a dismissive wave of the hand as if Tyson were just another bystander who might complain but wouldn't dare step closer. But Mike didn't stop. His steps were deliberate, heavy, each one echoing with the weight of decades of discipline, fights, triumphs, and mistakes that had shaped him into more than just a boxer, into a man who understood what it meant to stand up for someone who couldn't fight back. He crouched slightly, his massive frame lowering so he could look into the old woman's tear-streaked face, and with a gentleness that contrasted sharply against the violence of the officers, he asked her if she was all right. She tried to nod, but her voice broke into sobs, her hand trembling as it reached for the scattered groceries she could no longer hold. Tyson's jaw tightened. That was all he needed to see. Suddenly, the younger officer stepped forward, puffing out his chest, pointing his finger right at Tyson, demanding he back off. But Mike Tyson was not the type to be intimidated. Not by authority, not by uniforms, not when injustice played out right in front of him. He straightened to his full height, towering over the officer, his shoulders broad, his presence commanding. His eyes locked onto the man with a stare so intense it made the officer's voice falter mid-sentence. The crowd held its breath. Every camera phone was now aimed at Tyson, the scene going viral even before the outcome was clear, because this was bigger than just an argument. It was the collision of raw power, both physical and moral, against the abuse of power worn on a badge. Tyson raised a hand, not in a fist, not yet, but in a steady motion to signal for calm, his deep voice cutting through the tension as he told the officers to stop hurting her, to think about what they were doing. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The weight of his words was enough. But instead of backing down, the younger officer shoved him lightly on the chest, a move that made the crowd gasp audibly because everyone knew everyone that putting hands on Mike Tyson was like poking a sleeping lion. The moment stretched thin, seconds feeling like minutes, and the old woman whimpered again, clutching her bruised arm. Tyson's expression shifted, his lips pressed tight, his eyes narrowed, and for the first time that afternoon, the danger of what he was truly capable of radiated off him like heat from a furnace. He stepped even closer, the distance between him and the officer disappearing, his voice low but sharp as a blade as he warned, "Don't touch her again." The younger cop froze, his bravado cracking, his hand twitching nervously as he realized just who stood in front of him. But his partner, the older officer, wasn't ready to let go. He barked again, ordering Tyson to leave immediately or face arrest. And the absurdity of those words sent murmurs of disbelief through the crowd. Arrest Mike Tyson? For helping a defenseless old woman? The crowd stirred, anger mixing with fear, and it was clear that something was about to explode. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, turning into shouts from a few brave voices who could no longer stand by silently, their words echoing down the street. Let her go. Leave the old lady alone. He's right, you can't do that. And yet the officers stood their ground, one gripping the woman's frail wrist so tightly it left red marks, the other trying to puff himself up in front of Tyson, as if sheer authority could outweigh the silent storm brewing inside him. But everyone could feel it. The officers were losing control of the moment. They might have had the uniforms, the badges, the weapons strapped at their waists, but Tyson had something far more powerful. The unshakable presence of someone who had lived through battles in and out of the ring, who had faced demons darker than anything standing before him, and who had emerged with a kind of fearlessness that no threat could touch. His breathing was steady, his fists unclenched but heavy at his sides, and his eyes darted between the bruised woman and the officers, calculating, deciding how far he needed to go to protect her. The younger officer shouted again, ordering him to back off, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the tremor of uncertainty that ran through him. Tyson leaned closer, his voice calm, yet carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded arenas filled with roaring crowds. She's done nothing. Let her go. Now. The crowd erupted in agreement, their fear of speaking up diminishing as they drew courage from Tyson's presence. A young man in the back yelled, "You're abusing her!" while a mother pulled her child closer, whispering, "That's Mike Tyson, baby. He's not going to let them hurt her." The moment had turned into more than just an altercation. It had become a spectacle, the kind of raw, unscripted drama that people would replay and dissect endlessly once the videos hit the internet. But in the thick of it, for the old woman trembling on the ground, it wasn't about fame or headlines. It was about survival, about the hope that someone, finally, was willing to stand up when no one else would. Tyson bent lower again, his hand steady as he reached to help her up, and the officer who still clutched her wrist yanked her back, snarling something about resisting. That was the breaking point. Tyson's eyes narrowed into slits, his jaw muscles clenched, and for the first time, the dangerous shadow of the fighter within him flickered to life. He didn't swing, not yet, but the way he squared his stance, the way his body angled slightly forward, everyone in the crowd felt the tension shift, like the moment before thunder cracks across a dark sky. Phones trembled in people's hands as they recorded, because they all knew one wrong move from the officers, and history would be made right there on the sidewalk. The younger officer, sweating now, tried to push Tyson again, muttering something about arresting him for interference. But his words didn't carry weight anymore. The crowd booed, shouting back at him, and the chant started faintly at first, but grew louder, more unified. "Let her go! Let her go! Let her go!" The pressure of dozens of voices, combined with Tyson's unwavering stance, created a wall the officers couldn't ignore. The older one still tried, his face red, his pride clashing with the reality that the situation was slipping away. But Tyson leaned in so close their foreheads nearly touched, his voice deep and slow, like a final warning. "You lay another hand on her, and you'll regret it." The officer flinched, his composure cracking for just a second, and the crowd roared as if they had just witnessed a punch thrown. The old woman sobbed quietly, her hand trembling as she reached for Tyson's arm, silently pleading for him not to leave her side. And in that charged silence, with the weight of every eye on him, Tyson lifted her gently from the ground, his massive hands surprisingly tender as he steadied her wobbling legs. It was an image that would burn itself into memory. The fighter, the legend, cradling the fragile dignity of a woman who moments earlier had been tossed aside like nothing. And though no punches had been thrown yet, the fight was already underway. A battle of presence, of moral authority, of courage versus cruelty, and Tyson was winning. The street felt like it had transformed into an arena, the crowd packed tightly, on both sides of the sidewalk as if they were spectators around a boxing ring, holding their breath to see whether Tyson would unleash the fury that once made him the most feared man on the planet. The old woman leaned into his arm, her frail body trembling as she clung to him, and her whisper was barely audible but carried the weight of 1,000 emotions. "Don't let them hurt me." That simple plea ignited something deep inside. Tyson. Something primal, something protective. The same spark that had carried him through fights when the world counted him out. He glanced down at her, then back up at the officers, his eyes narrowing into that predatory glare that opponents used to see in the seconds before the first bell rang. The younger officer barked at him again, raising a hand as if to shove Tyson back once more, but the crowd's collective gasp and furious shouts made him hesitate, his arm freezing mid-air. The older officer, stubborn and red-faced, decided to step forward instead, his hand hovering near his holster as if threatening to draw his weapon. The very sight of that gesture sent a ripple of fear through the onlookers. Parents shielded their children's eyes, others stepped backward, but no one left, because the weight of history was about to unfold. Tyson didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted the woman slightly behind him, shielding her completely with his own body, his frame broad and immovable like a wall, his voice dropping into a deep, rumbling growl that silenced every other sound. "Put your hand down. You don't need that gun." The older officer's eyes flickered, his authority challenged in a way he had never experienced before, not by another civilian, but by a man whose very existence carried mythic proportions. For a moment, it looked like he might actually draw it, and the tension reached a breaking point. The crowd screamed out warnings. "Don't do it! Are you crazy? He's protecting her!" Phones were held higher, and somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, other units racing toward the scene. But before it could spiral completely, Tyson took a single step forward, his sheer proximity enough to make the officer's hand falter and drop away from the holster. The relief in the crowd was palpable, cheers breaking through the fear, but the situation was far from over. The younger cop, emboldened again, lunged forward and tried to yank the woman's arm free from Tyson's grasp. But this time Tyson reacted instantly. He pivoted slightly, his hand snapping out with lightning speed, not to strike but to clamp firmly around the officer's wrist, freezing him mid-motion. The gasp from the onlookers was deafening. Tyson's grip was legendary, a vice-like strength that needed no punch to convey its danger. The officer winced, his bravado cracking as he realized just how powerless he was in that moment. Tyson leaned closer, his voice quiet but venomous, so only the officer could hear. "You don't touch her again, ever." The younger man stumbled back when Tyson released him, rubbing his wrist, glaring but too shaken to move forward again. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices swelling into chants of Tyson's name. "Mike! Mike! Mike!" They shouted not just for the fighter but for the protector, the man who had stepped into a fight that wasn't his but had made it his responsibility. The old woman wept openly now, clutching her groceries to her chest with what strength she had left, whispering thanks through broken sobs. Tyson gently patted her shoulder, his massive hand covering half of her back, and gave her a soft nod, as if to say he wasn't going anywhere until she was safe. The officers looked around, realizing they had lost control, not just of the situation but of the narrative. Every camera was on them, every angle recording their every move, and they knew the headlines were already being written. The older officer, humiliated and furious, barked into his radio for backup, his voice trembling despite his attempts to sound authoritative. The sirens grew louder, flashing lights appearing at the end of the block, but the crowd didn't disperse. If anything, they pressed in closer, chanting louder, turning the scene into a public trial where Tyson was both defense and judge. He glanced toward the oncoming vehicles, then back at the trembling woman, and made his decision. He wasn't going to leave her side, he wasn't going to back down, and no matter how many more uniforms arrived, they weren't going to get past him without facing the storm that was Mike Tyson. The flashing red and blue lights painted the buildings in strobing colors as more police cruisers screeched to a halt at the intersection, their tires squealing as doors flew open and officers poured out in groups, batons in hand, hands hovering near holsters, the scene transforming into a standoff that looked less like a city street and more like the opening act of a riot. The crowd pressed closer, their voices swelling with anger and support, chanting Tyson's name, shouting at the officers, their phones raised high like torches in the night, recording every second of what was rapidly becoming a defining moment. The elderly woman, clutched tightly against Tyson's side, trembled so violently he could feel her bones shake through her clothes, but he held her steady, his arm a shield, his presence a wall. His eyes swept over the new arrivals, calculating, unshaken, his body angled forward like a fighter stepping into the center of the ring. And then it happened. The commanding officer of the reinforcement stepped forward, barking orders into the chaos, demanding the crowd disperse and ordering Tyson to release the woman immediately. The absurdity of those words was so thick, it drew boos and jeers from the onlookers because everyone there knew exactly what was happening. Tyson wasn't restraining her. He was protecting her. But authority has a way of blinding men, and these officers didn't see a protector. They saw defiance, a challenge to their control, and they responded with the only language they understood. Intimidation. They formed. a semicircle around Tyson and the woman, their boots thudding on the pavement in unison, their batons raised just slightly, not high enough to swing yet, but high enough to threaten. The crowd roared in outrage, voices clashing, the chant of, "Let her go!" and "Tyson, Tyson," echoing like the call and response of a stadium. Tyson, towering in the center of it all, didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, he raised his free hand slowly, palm open, his deep voice booming across the chaos. "She's not leaving my side. You put your weapons down before you do something you'll regret for the rest of your lives." His words sliced through the air, resonating with the kind of authority no badge could match. The commanding officer sneered, but the hesitation in his eyes betrayed him. This wasn't just any man in front of him. This was a legend, a name known across the globe, a figure whose fists had knocked giants to the ground, and now whose courage had turned an entire street into a theater of justice. The younger officers glanced at each other nervously, their grips tightening on their batons, some already doubting the orders given. The crowd sensed it too, their energy shifting from fear to defiance, their confidence rising in unison with Tyson's stance. And then, a moment that would be replayed millions of times on social media unfolded. One officer, perhaps too inexperienced or too rash, lunged forward with his baton raised, aiming not at Tyson, but at the old woman, as if punishing. The weakest link would force Tyson to back down. But before the baton could even descend, Tyson moved. It was a blur, a flash of speed that defied his age, his hand snapping out, catching the officer's wrist mid-swing with the precision of a cobra strike. The baton froze inches above the woman's shoulder, trapped in Tyson's iron grip. Gasps erupted from the crowd, some screaming in shock, others cheering in awe. Tyson's voice was thunder now, deep and furious. "You dare raise your hand to her?" With a flick of his wrist, he wrenched the baton free, tossing it onto the pavement where it clattered uselessly at his feet. The officer stumbled back, clutching his arm, wide-eyed with the realization that he had just stood inches from disaster. The crowd erupted into wild cheers, their chants shaking the air, their admiration for Tyson soaring into a frenzy. The commanding officer barked for order, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos, his control slipping through his fingers. Tyson turned, his massive frame shielding the woman entirely, his voice cutting through the roar like a hammer. "She leaves with me. You're not touching her again. If you want to come through me, then try, but understand this. I won't let you hurt her." His words weren't a threat. They were a promise. The officers faltered, their line breaking as doubt crept in. Some looked to their commander, others to the ground, unwilling to meet Tyson's fiery glare. The crowd, emboldened beyond measure, surged forward a step, no longer just spectators but participants, their bodies forming a protective wall behind Tyson, their voices thundering in unity. Parents, workers, teenagers, strangers, everyone in that crowd stood together, their fear melted into solidarity, their strength amplified by the presence of one man who had chosen to step forward when no one else would. And as the flashing lights painted the chaos in red and blue, the truth became undeniable. This was no longer a fight between one man and the police. This was a fight between justice and oppression, between courage and cruelty, between a protector and abusers. And standing at the heart of it all, shoulders squared, eyes burning, fists ready if necessary, was Mike Tyson, ready to prove that some battles go far beyond the ring. The roar of the crowd had turned into something primal, a wall of sound that reverberated off the concrete and glass of the buildings around them, swelling higher with every second the police tried to advance. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a declaration, a collective voice refusing to let injustice reign unchecked. Tyson stood at the center, his chest heaving with steady breaths, his stance coiled with the kind of readiness only decades in the ring could give a man. His massive shoulders squared as if daring the entire line of officers to test him. The elderly woman clutched his arm tightly, her fingers trembling against his skin, her eyes wide with terror but glimmering now with the faintest trace of hope, because she knew, everyone knew, that as long as he was there, she wasn't going to be abandoned again. The commanding officer barked louder, his face twisted in frustration as he shouted for his men to hold the line, to push forward if necessary. But hesitation rippled through the ranks. This wasn't some faceless civilian. This was Mike Tyson, a man whose name carried weight even among those who didn't follow boxing, whose very image could summon memories of knockouts so brutal they became legend. To raise hands against him in front of dozens of cameras, against the tidal wave of a crowd chanting his name, was to invite a disaster, not just for themselves, but for the entire department. Still, the desperation to reassert control pushed the commander into recklessness. He stepped forward, his baton raised high, his eyes flashing with authority he no longer truly held, shouting that Tyson was under arrest for interference and obstruction. The crowd booed so loudly the street shook with it, a wave of defiance so strong even nearby shopkeepers came to their windows to see history unfolding. Tyson didn't move at first. He just stared, his eyes fixed on the baton, his fists slowly curling at his sides, the veins in his forearms taut as if the storm inside him was just barely being contained. The officer swung the baton downward in a motion meant to intimidate. But Tyson moved faster than anyone thought possible. His hand shot up, catching the baton mid-strike, the crack of leather against his palm echoing like thunder. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The crowd went silent. The officer's eyes widened in disbelief, and then Tyson's low growl broke the stillness. "Enough!" The baton dropped to the ground, Tyson tossing it aside like it was nothing more than a twig. The officer stumbled, backward, humiliated, his authority shattered in front of his men. The crowd erupted, their cheers deafening now, their chants of "Tyson, Tyson" rolling like thunder down the block. But the police line still stood, tense and twitching, their uncertainty battling with their orders. Some shuffled nervously, others lowered their batons slightly, their gazes darting between their commander and Tyson as though waiting for someone to break the spell. Tyson turned to the crowd, raising his free hand, his voice booming with a conviction that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. "You don't let them treat you like this. You stand up. You protect each other. You don't walk away when you see someone suffering." His words struck like lightning, igniting the crowd into cheers and sobs, some clapping, others raising their fists, the energy swelling so high it felt unstoppable. For the first time, the balance of power had truly shifted, not because of violence, but because one man had stood his ground with courage and inspired hundreds to do the same. The officers faltered, their line visibly breaking, the crowd pushing forward in solidarity. The old woman, tears streaking her face, clutched Tyson's hand tighter and whispered shakily, "Thank you. Thank you, my son." And those words pierced even deeper than the chaos around them, fueling Tyson's resolve to see this through, to the end. The commander, desperate and red-faced, shouted once more for order, but his voice cracked, drowned beneath the tidal wave of defiance. He reached for his radio, screaming for more reinforcements, but the crowd was no longer afraid, no longer backing down, and in the middle of it all, Tyson didn't move an inch. He stood like an immovable pillar, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing, his presence more commanding than sirens, batons, or guns could ever hope to be. The message was clear. No matter how many more officers came, no matter how many threats were made, he wasn't going to let them drag that woman down again. The atmosphere was electric, a raw tension hanging in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. But the crowd had already chosen their side. This wasn't just Tyson versus the police anymore. It was Tyson and the people versus oppression. And as he stood there, breathing steady, the veins in his arms alive with restrained fury, he looked less like a retired boxer and more like a warrior reborn, proving that legends don't retire. They rise when the world needs them most. Frère. Old woman, still trembling but now clinging tightly to the arm of the man who had just changed her entire world, felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. Around her, the street was no longer just a place of fear but one of transformation, because where once there was cruelty, now there was courage, and where once there was silence, now there was a roar of voices that could never again be silenced. Mike Tyson did not stand there as a former champion, nor as a man known for his fists and his fame, but as a human being who saw injustice and refused to let it pass. The police, humbled and stripped of their power by the raw presence of accountability, hung their heads while the community that had gathered stood taller than ever before, united not by fear, but by shared strength. Phones remained raised, capturing the moment in every possible angle, because this was more than just a confrontation on a dimly lit street. It was history in the making, proof that even in the darkest situations, light could shine through when someone chose to stand up, to intervene, to care. And as Tyson spoke softly to the woman, promising that he would personally see to it that she received proper care, legal assistance, and the dignity she had been denied, there was an undeniable shift in the air, a sense that the world had just been reminded of something powerful, that no matter how ruthless authority may seem, no matter how heavy the boots of corruption may press down, one act of bravery, one refusal to walk away, one moment of standing with the vulnerable can undo the entire narrative of despair. The crowd cheered his name, but Tyson simply shook his head, pointing instead to the woman and saying, "She's the real fighter, don't forget that." And in that single sentence, he gave back to her the power and respect that had been stripped away, turning what began as a scene of brutality into a story of redemption, solidarity, and unshakable hope.